The Army shrank from its Vietnam high of 1.6 million in 1968 to fewer than 800,000 in 1974. This meant a greater reliance than ever on the reserves. This was the total force policy. The three components of the Army, regular Army, reserves, and National Guard, would be treated as a single force. The Volunteer Army also meant a more expansive policy toward women. In 1978, there were 53,000 women in the Army. By '83, that was up to 80,000. Training for women was greatly improved and began to include training in small arms. Then, in the year of the nation's 200th birthday, over 100 women were admitted to the military academy at West Point. The Women's Army Corps was no more. These women were soldiers. And this process continued, with individual units including both men and women. By 1990, when the Army went to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, almost 9% were women. The Gulf War was the first major operation for the Army since Vietnam. Despite participation in operations in El Salvador, Grenada, and Panama, the Army was largely untested over the previous 2 decades. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, in fact, there was much talk about shrinking the military, no longer needed now that its enemy was gone. Its overwhelming success against Iraq in 1990 through 91 would demonstrate to the world that the U.S. maintained the finest fighting force on earth. After Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, America's first priority became the defense of Saudi Arabia. General Norman Schwarzkopf, Jr., Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Central Command, had recently developed a contingency plan for the defense of the oil fields of the Persian Gulf in the case of invasion by Iraq, and that plan became the basis for Operation Desert Shield, the defense of Saudi Arabia. A few months later, Schwarzkopf's offensive plan, Desert Storm, pushed Iraq out of Kuwait. After the Gulf War, the Army performed missions in Somalia, Haiti, Yugoslavia. International missions with the U.S. Army taking a major role. During this period, the Army downsized by 1/3, while nonetheless being active overseas. With the enemies a half-century gone, the Army was developing more and more the capability to go anywhere and do anything, rather than focus entirely on Cold War struggles. Then, on September 11th, 2001, the world changed. The Al-Qaeda attacks on the homeland shook the nation and reoriented the military toward a prolonged war against non-state actors, a war of both defense and offense. National Guardsmen augmented the security of airports around the country. Soldiers were deployed to assist agencies such as the U.S. Border Patrol. And in less than a month, Operation Enduring Freedom began with a series of air and missile strikes against Taliban command and control targets, combined with humanitarian food drops to demonstrate that the U.S. was at war with the government, not the people of Afghanistan. In November 2001, the Taliban was forced to flee from Kabul. But the fight was far from over. The war in Afghanistan would become America's longest-running war. As of 2012, American forces are still fighting in Afghanistan. And while the long, deadly mission in Afghanistan continued, the U.S. also returned to an old foe, Saddam Hussein in Iraq. U.S. Army General Tommy Franks led an invasion into Iraq on March 19, 2003. Just a few weeks later, on April 9th, Baghdad fell to U.S. and coalition forces, ending Saddam Hussein's 24-year rule. But, as with Afghanistan, the war in Iraq did not end with the collapse of the belligerent government. In both Afghanistan and Iraq, America's armed forces have faced a long, deadly fight against insurgent forces. In Afghanistan and Iraq, our soldiers continue to demonstrate the courage and determination that they have shown for over 200 years. Soldiers like Army Sergeant First Class Paul Smith in Iraq. Sergeant Smith was killed in April 2003 when he exposed himself to the enemy as he and fellow soldiers were attacked while building a prisoner of war holding area. His posthumous Medal of Honor citation reads, "Fearing the enemy would overrun their defenses, Sergeant First Class Smith moved under withering enemy fire to man a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a damaged armored personnel carrier. In total disregard for his own life, he maintained his exposed position in order to engage the attacking enemy force. During this action, he was mortally wounded." Private First Class Ross McGinnis also earned the Medal of Honor, received posthumously, for choosing to put his body between a fragmentation grenade and his fellow soldiers in Iraq in December 2006. In November 2010, Army Staff Sergeant Salvador Junta was presented with his Medal of Honor for actions in Afghanistan on October 25, 2007. In May 2008, Army Staff Sergeant Leroy Petrie and his 2 fellow Rangers had been wounded by enemy fire and shrapnel from a grenade. When a second grenade landed among them, Staff Sergeant Petrie, with complete disregard to his own safety, scooped up the grenade and threw it away from his fellow Rangers. The grenade detonated as he released it, amputating his right hand at the wrist and further injuring him with multiple shrapnel wounds. These soldiers, and the tens of thousands of men and women fighting in America's Army today, continue to provide an inspiration to Americans young and old. They remind us all that freedom isn't free, that America has enemies that must be fought, and that we are honored to have American soldiers volunteer to be the shield and sword that defends us all. In its more than 2 centuries of existence, the Army has stood against enemies both foreign and domestic. Composed of both professional warriors and citizen soldiers, the Army won the nation's liberty from Great Britain. It defended settlers from attacks by indigenous tribes that were often supported by European nations. It defeated insurrectionist forces from the short-lived Confederate States of America. It supported our allies while defending our own interests abroad, and it proved our willingness and ability to resist Soviet and communist expansion. And it followed our enemies to every corner of the earth.
If you're eager to see more of our historical documentaries, please like, share, and subscribe.